This is the story of the most breathtakingly stupid decision in American history. Back then, politicians honestly believed they could just sweep a massive crisis under the rug and pretend everything was totally fine. But that cheap compromise didn't save the nation. It set the entire country on fire, tore families apart, and ignited the bloodiest war the American continent has ever seen. Have you ever wondered how a massive superpower could completely tear itself apart, not because of an outside invasion, but because its own people turned on each other? Well, that's the dark tragedy of the American Civil War, a disaster born from a ticking time bomb everyone saw coming. For decades, politicians basically kicked the can down the road, relying on Band-Aid fixes and cheap political compromises to avoid the massive elephant in the room, slavery. But from the Missouri Compromise to the chaotic Bleeding Kansas, where people were literally shooting each other over local votes, the tension became impossible to contain. Everything finally blew up during the election of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without getting a single vote from the South. Terrified of losing their entire way of life and an economy completely built on slave labor, 7 Southern states split off, formed the Confederacy, and fired the opening shots at Fort Sumter in 1861. At first, everyone arrogantly assumed this whole thing would be over in 90 days. Heck, wealthy civilians even packed picnic baskets and sat on hillsides to watch the Battle of Bull Run like it was a weekend show. But that fantasy instantly shattered when the war turned into a brutally long 4-year slaughterhouse. The real turning point came when Lincoln made a brilliant strategic move with the Emancipation Proclamation. By declaring enslaved people free, he effectively blocked European powers from helping the South while inspiring hundreds of thousands of black soldiers to join the Union fight. Following the absolute bloodbath at Gettysburg and the relentless total war strategy of General Ulysses S. Grant that crushed the Southern infrastructure, the war finally ended in 1865. But the victory came with a terrifying price tag: over 620,000 lives lost, and Lincoln himself was assassinated just 5 days after the South surrendered. Reconstruction era was an absolute political soap opera. Imagine trying to glue a shattered country back together when half the population still deeply hated the other half. Right after Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, took over, and honestly, he made a complete mess of things. Johnson was way too soft on the former Confederate leaders, allowing them to pass black codes, basically sneaky local laws designed to keep newly freed African Americans as close to slavery as humanly possible. This made Congress so furious that they literally tried to kick Johnson out of office through impeachment, took control of the entire process themselves, and sent the U.S. Army down south to forcibly protect the civil rights of freed slaves and rebuild the broken region from scratch. For a brief, incredible moment, things actually looked promising. Former slaves were getting educated, buying land, and even winning seats in the U.S. Senate. But that progress triggered a toxic, violent backlash. Secret white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged from the shadows, using terror, intimidation, and outright murder to strip Black Americans of their rights and regain political control. By 1877, Northern politicians grew exhausted, packed up the military, and effectively walked away, a shady deal known as the Compromise of 1877. The federal government basically left the South to its own devices, paving the way for nearly a century of brutal Jim Crow segregation laws. So while the Civil War successfully ended slavery and kept the nation united on paper, the failure of Reconstruction left deep, painful scars that America is still grappling with to this very day. Now, while the country was busy tearing itself apart and trying to rebuild from the ashes, something incredible was happening just beyond the horizon: the wild, chaotic explosion of the American Wild West. You see, during the middle of the war in 1862, Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, basically offering 160 acres of free land to anyone brave enough to head west and farm it for 5 years. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of desperate war veterans, former slaves searching for freedom, and hopeful European immigrants packed up their lives and rushed into the unknown. To connect this massive new frontier to the east, workers pulled off an engineering miracle by building the Transcontinental Railroad, driving the famous Golden Spike in 1869, and shrinking a treacherous 6-month wagon journey down to a mere 6 days. On paper, it sounded like the ultimate American dream, but in reality, it was a brutal, lawless free-for-all. As boomtowns popped up overnight around gold mines and cattle trails, famous gunslingers and outlaws like Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp turned the West into a legendary battleground of quick-draw duels and bank robberies. But the true heartbreaking cost of this grand expansion was paid by the Native American tribes who had called these lands home for thousands of years. The U.S. government systematically slaughtered millions of buffalo, the lifeblood of plains tribes, and forced indigenous populations off their ancestral lands through brutal military campaigns like the Indian Wars. By the time the frontier was officially declared closed in 1890 after the tragedy at Wounded Knee, America had successfully transformed itself into a coast-to-coast industrial powerhouse, but it was built on the back of displacement, conflict, and the unrelenting myth of the Wild West. As America expanded from coast to coast, the country stepped right out of the dust of the Wild West and straight into the blinding glare of the Gilded Age and the Industrial Revolution. On the surface, late 19th century America looked like a gleaming paradise of progress. Skyscrapers were piercing the skyline, electric lights were turning night into day, and men like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie were building massive monopolies in oil and steel, becoming richer than most modern billionaires combined. But if you scratched beneath that shiny golden surface, you'd find a reality that was ugly, ruthless, and deeply corrupt. While tycoon robber barons lived in golden mansions, millions of poor factory workers and new immigrants were crammed into dark, disease-ridden tenements, working 14-hour days in death trap factories for literal pennies. Even young children were forced to work heavy machinery instead of going to school. This unbearable inequality eventually sparked a massive wave of outrage. Furious workers organized violent strikes, forming labor unions to demand fair pay and the 8-hour workday we take for granted today. At the same time, fearless investigative journalists, known as muckrakers, started exposing corporate greed and political corruption, giving rise to the Progressive Era. America was rapidly transforming into the world's greatest economic power, but it was being forged in the heat of a fierce battle between corporate greed and the everyday working class. With all this massive industrial wealth and economic power surging inside its borders, America quickly realized it could no longer just sit back and stay isolated from the rest of the world, setting the stage for the rise of American imperialism and World War I. By the late 1890s, the U.S. looked around and saw European empires carving up the global map, and politicians said, "Why not us?" In 1898, after a mysterious explosion sank the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor, America jumped into the Spanish-American War, swiftly kicking Spain out of the Western Hemisphere and grabbing control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while also annexing Hawaii. Almost overnight, the former colony had officially transformed into a global empire with territories stretched across 2 oceans. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, America initially tried to play it cool and stay completely neutral, focusing on making money by selling supplies to both sides. But that peaceful stance didn't last long. Tensions boiled over when German submarines started sinking American merchant ships, and the British intercepted the famous Zimmermann telegram, a secret German plot encouraging Mexico to attack the U.S. Furious, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war in 1917 to make the world safe for democracy. The arrival of over 2 million fresh, heavily equipped American troops instantly broke the deadly stalemate in the trenches of Europe, forcing Germany to surrender in 1918. When the dust settled, Europe was left battered and financially broke, while the United States emerged as an undisputed, formidable global superpower, setting the stage for the American century that would shape the modern world. But remember, no empire lasts forever. America may have emerged as the ultimate victor of the 20th century, But its unresolved sins, deep-seated divisions, and blinding arrogance are once again slowly eating the nation away from the inside. The question is no longer whether history will repeat itself, but just how catastrophic the collapse will be when that ticking time bomb finally detonates again.